Postscript and Eilat fish. In the autumn of 2007, there was a philatelic convention in Hartford, Connecticut. I went because I used to collect stamps as a kid. Both my parents collected stamps and got me interested. My mom would have saved postcards of friends traveling the world over, and my dad once had a valuable stamp collection in Europe, but German soldiers took it away from him when they invaded his home in Poland. Since moving to the USA, he continued his stamp collecting hobby and purchased many stamps from around the world. He liked to collect stamps from Europe, especially from countries that did not exist anymore. He probably thought that would make them rare. My mom, on the other hand, collected the American commemoratives. Going over the collection, I learned about history, languages, coin of the realm, and geography. Both my mom and dad collected Israeli stamps, and already I was struck by how beautiful they were for a small country. I also remember seeing Israeli stamps at Hebrew school because some of my classmates collected them and traded them like baseball cards. The ones that stood out the most to me were the stamps of the tropical Eilat fish of the Red Sea coral reef, maybe because they were exotic for someone used to swimming in the Long Island Sound. I even received Israeli stamps as a gift from a Jewish neighbor whose home I was invited to for Sabbath meals. A square block made of 4 triangular stamps commemorated an archaeological find from biblical times in Sipori, northern Israel. Known as the Mona Lisa of the Galilee, the image was of a Roman woman's face on a mosaic floor, and it became even more famous once a line of beauty products in Israel used this mosaic as a logo. Of course, when I lived in Israel, I got to visit the mosaic at its location. At the entrance to the convention was an Israeli blue and white flag, advertising an Israeli stamp dealer. I went there first. The dealer dealt with Judaica stamps as well as Israeli stamps. I brought some of my parents' stamps with me to appraise and possibly sell a few, and I knew there were some old Israeli stamps mixed in. Sitting at the table before me was an elderly couple who wanted to purchase Israeli stamps for their grandson, who was going to have a bar mitzvah. Nice idea for a gift, I chuckled. The stamps I had with me, I brought with me from Israel, and others were sent to me from my father by mail before he passed away. I left about half the collection with my daughters in the hopes that they would learn about the world through the stamps as I did. At the convention, I showed the stamps to the dealer, still in that same rainproof pouch, and told them they were from 40 to 50 years ago, many from countries heralded from the old British Empire and no longer existed, and a collection from Ethiopia. I have no idea why my father collected stamps from Ethiopia. The stamp dealer dipped through them, shrugged, and muttered how they weren't anything special or worth his money. My jaw dropped. I was almost arrested for these. Taking note of my reaction, the dealer left me with some words of wisdom that I heard once before from a coin collector. If you did not pay a significant sum of money for them to begin with, they are probably not worth much. Discouraged, I hunted for a second opinion and found an international stamp dealer trading in stamps from both Israel and from the Palestine Authority. I asked if I can see the Palestinian stamps, and he cheered me on, noting how they were selling fast since they were going out of print. No kidding, I thought, considering how the Palestinian Authority had splintered since the Hamas revolt. Here was the first time I laid eyes on stamps from the Palestinian Authority, which offices were only about 2 hours away from where I once lived, and I was taken aback by their beauty. We were neighbors in a sense, yet we lived in very different worlds apart. I wondered, being neighbors and in a technical peace agreement, if any of the Palestinian stamps had acknowledged their Israeli neighbors. Some of the stamps commemorated Yasser Arafat, the late Palestinian chairman, visiting different dignitaries. He was always visiting a dignitary to try and gain support for a Palestinian state. The more pleasing stamps commemorated Christian holy sites like Bethlehem and the Christian holidays. I then considered to whom were the mostly Muslim Palestinians trying to sell their wares, bearing in mind that Christians made up the majority in many parts of the world. The prettiest stamps were of the flowers, trees, fruits, and birds of the area of what they call Palestine, and I was struck by how strange I felt looking at them. These were the same flowers, trees, fruits, and birds of Israel, my Israel. I felt cheated in some way. Were these two different nations living on the same land, one trying to usurp the other or commit identity theft? Or were these two interrelated peoples sharing the same land and glorifying her common bounty? The answer came with the last stamp I saw from the batch. It bore both the Israeli and Palestinian flags poised behind the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, alongside Yasser Arafat, and shaking hands. That famous handshake took place in front of President Bill Clinton on the White House lawn following the Oslo peace agreement. For me, this stamp answered another question most Israelis have. Do the Palestinians recognize Israel? I would have to assume that if the Israeli flag is on one of the PA stamps, then they do, or they at least intended to back when the stamp was issued. I went ahead and bought some of those Palestinian stamps, although I could not get any first issue since they had sold out. These stamps inspired me to make a collection in which Arab stamps commemorate, or at least recognize in some fashion, Israeli culture and vice versa. I already had purchased Israeli stamps commemorating Arab culture that I knew existed before coming to the convention, and it seemed like the perfect idea. At the basic level, every Israeli stamp has the words Israel Post in 3 official languages, Hebrew, English, and Arabic. I went back to the first Israeli stamp dealer and asked if he had Israeli stamps with an Arab motif, and was disappointed to hear him say an emphatic no. I then asked him if he by any chance had Palestine Authority stamps, thinking maybe I could get a first issue from him. He glared at me and sharply shook his head, and I realized perhaps I hit a nerve, and then I noticed another change that came over me by living in Israel. I had experience living and working with Arabs as neighbors, and respected them as people, even if they had a different and conflicting political agenda than me. When I returned home, I searched for Israeli Arab stamps online and found that Israel did commemorate Arab culture with a stamp in 1971 of the historic El Jazar Mosque in Akko. There was also a Land of 3 Religions stamp with a picture of a mosque, and also a Dome of the Rock stamp in 1981. In addition, there was a stamp commemorating the late King Hussein of Jordan, who signed a peace treaty with Israel. But then, my searching for stamps came across this bothersome warning. Beware. If you want to visit an Arab country, make sure you don't have an Israeli stamp in your passport.